Let me introduce our speaker. And I got formal stuff to say, and then I'm going to say Doug. I'm going to start out with Doug's stuff. So a few months ago, I got a phone call from a friend who said there's a guy you need to meet. And he said he's a 3-star general. Now, my ears come up, it's like, because I'm a big fan and supporter of our military and whatnot. But I went, I've never talked to a 3-star general. That would be pretty cool. Right? I want to understand what makes these guys tick. So I said, yeah, I'd be interested. And they started telling me what he was interested in doing. So I got on an airplane, flew out to Tucson, Arizona, where he was going to be speaking at a corporate function, and had the opportunity to go in with some of the executives and meet some of those. And I had the opportunity to listen to him speak. I also had the opportunity, which was even more important, sit down and have dinner with he and his wife. And one of the things that really impressed me, more than just the idea that he was a 3-star general, retired now, was the kind of man that he was. And the principles that he lived his life by, the man of faith, he just, all the things that if you could imagine, you would want to be one of the senior officers of your military, right? And the people who are protecting our freedom. And it's more about the character. Now, I'll guarantee you some of the things you're going to hear him talk about tonight are even more than that. It's not just about the character, but it's also about the, his experiences and the things he's learned in his years. But he mentioned one thing to me. Of course, after this program, he gets a standing ovation. Of course, I call and say, man, Rick, I'd love for you to come and speak at our conference and do the opening night keynote. Would you be willing to do that? He said, oh, absolutely, I'd love to do it, but I have one stipulation. He said, for the last 30 plus years, whatever it was he's been in the military, my wife always traveled with me. He said, I've been without my family so many years, for so long over the many years. He said, I dare not leave my family anymore, so my wife travels with me. So his beautiful wife, Sarah, and I said, absolutely. She's on the agenda too. So, and that's a great statement, a type of character of the gentleman that we're having speaking tonight. It was more than just speaking about leadership. It's about family, and it's about those values. So with that, I'm going to give you the formal kind of introduction, right? Rick Lynch, which I think official title is retired Lieutenant General. I didn't know Lieutenant General and 3 stars went together, so that was important learning for me. But as Lieutenant General in the United States Army, Rick Lynch commanded the Installation Management Command, which was responsible for managing all 163 installations in the U.S. Army. He oversaw a $12.3 billion budget and a worldwide workforce of 120,000 people, where they focused on providing our soldiers, families, and civilians with a quality of life commensurate with their quality of service. And that's how Rick views that. And I think what you will absolutely enjoy hearing Rick's message. And Rick, with that, love to have you. Thanks.
When I introduce myself, candidly, I don't introduce myself as Lieutenant General Lynch, or I don't talk about my 35 years in the military. I don't talk about the titles I had. I introduce myself as Sarah's husband and the father of Susan and Lucas. And that's important that you understand that straight up, because that's the most important thing to me. My priorities in life have always been my relationship with God, number 1, my family, number 2, and my profession, number 3, and it's served me pretty well over time. If you see soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines these days on the streets or in the airports, wherever it might be, please stop them and tell them thank you for their sacrifice. We've been at war 10 years, and candidly, we believe we're going to be at war at least 10 more years, regardless of what you see in the open press. If we don't fight the terrorists in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, we're going to fight them in places like Raleigh, North Carolina. I worry about our nation because we have a short-term memory. There are people who have forgotten we were attacked on 9/11 and 3,000 Americans were killed on our soil, and that could happen again. So when you see our service members, please pause and tell them thank you, but more importantly, thank the families. What the families are going through is unbelievable and almost unbearable. And you can imagine it. Can you imagine multiple deployments? These youngsters now have deployed to combat probably 4 or 5 times over the last 10 years. They're gone more than they're home. I remember when I was a Corps commander, a Corps is 64,000 people. I commanded Fort Hood, Texas, which is the largest installation in the free world, just north of Austin, Texas. A young captain came into my office, and the captain says, "General, I got a problem." I said, "What's the problem?" He says, "My wife and I have been married 5 years. And in those 5 years, I've deployed 3 times, twice to Afghanistan and once to Iraq." He says, "We have a 4-year-old son, and my son calls me by my first name because he doesn't know me as his father." Last night as we went to bed, 149,632 children went to bed while their mom or dad was deployed to combat for the 3rd or 4th time. We're seeing indications of problems in schools with military children. Grades are down, accident and discipline are up. The strain on the families is unbelievable and almost unbearable. So I just beg you, if you don't get anything else out of this conversation, I just beg you to make it a point to thank service members and their families, because freedom isn't free. And wherever I go, like Doug says, I travel with Sarah, because we were Part 5 of the last 10 years. Generals are not immune to the deployments. So I refuse, now that I'm retired and dressed like this instead of dressing like that, I refuse to go anywhere without my wife. I refuse to do that. So Doug, thank you for your gracious offer to allow me to present, and for including Sarah. And oh, by the way, if you'd have said no to Sarah, I wouldn't
be here.
It'd have been that way. Doug has asked me to talk about how to be victorious, how to increase strategic partnerships, and how to improve overall performance, which is really the theme of what you're trying to get out of these next 3 days. And I know a little bit about that based on my career in the United States Army and what I'm doing now at the University of Texas at Arlington. So if you'll bear with me, I'd kind of like to talk about those issues: how to increase strategic partnerships, how to improve overall performance, and I want to structure that around a presentation that talks about the 3 C's: communication, collaboration, and commitment. Those 3 C's. Let me give you a sense of the things that I've done and the experience that I've had that have taught me things that might be applicable to you. And I'll just use my time as a general officer. I was a general officer for 10 years prior to retirement. One of the first things I had a chance to do was work in NATO. Everybody know what NATO is? North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, candidly, we say it's no action, talk only, but that's a different subject. That's a different subject. But I was minding my own business in Naples, Italy, as the operations officer for all of Southern Europe as a 2-star general. And I got a call one day from Jim Jones, who was the 4-star Marine general who ran all of Europe. He was called the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. And he says, "Rick, we got a situation." He says, "The government of Greece has asked for NATO's help to secure the Olympics in Athens, Greece in 2004. And he called me and he said, "Rick, you're going to be in charge of that operation." And this is 3 weeks prior to the start of the Olympics. And I realized upon retrospect that he'd worked his way through a lot of generals more senior to me, and he got to me, the only guy who could say, "Okay, I'll do it." So I took off to Athens, Greece, and I commanded the NATO forces as part of the 2004 Olympics. And you can imagine what a diverse force that was and how complicated that mission was. But we worked our way through it, and thank God it was a secure Olympics. I did make a mistake. I took about a 60-person staff with me. It was a 16,000-person force. I took a 60-person staff with me, and I wanted to make sure that I had instant visibility of what was taking on in the Olympics, taking place at each of the venues. And we had passes to go to every venue. So I got my staff together. I said, "Okay, there's 30 of you on shift, 30 of you off shift. When you're off shift, go to the venues. And you can go to whatever venue you choose to go to. But get out there with your cell phone, and if something goes wrong, call me." Because candidly, I was worried about how I was going to find out too late to do anything about it if something was going to go wrong. And I let that ride for about 3 days. And after 3 days, I had an epiphany. Since I allowed my staff to go to whatever venue they chose to go to, I realized after 3 days, I had beach volleyball covered. I had it covered. It would have been impossible for something bad to go wrong at beach volleyball without me getting 30 phone calls at the same time. So I immediately had to change that direction and take away some of their latitude as to which venues they would go to. But that was, as a general officer, that was a complicated situation and a diverse workforce working through numerous issues. After that, I took one of my 3 tours to Iraq, and I became the Deputy Chief of Staff for Political, Military, and Economic Affairs for Iraq. I worked with Ambassador Khalilzad. And then one day, George Casey called me in. He was the guy in charge of all of Iraq. He called me in and said, okay, Rick, here's the deal. As of today, in addition to doing the political, military, and economic stuff, you're also the spokesman for the force. You're going to be the guy dealing with the media on a daily basis and sharing the story of how operations are going on in Iraq. And this in 2006, and candidly, things weren't going that well. And I explained as a 2-star general to this 4-star general that I'd prefer not to do that. And then he reminded me that he was the 4-star general and I was a 2-star general. And we call it general officer math. 4 beats 3 beats 2 all the time. So I ended up being the spokesman for the force. And in addition to that, I was the guy that was negotiating in 2006 with the Sunni insurgents. I would find myself in a room, just me and a translator, with 13 of the leaders of the Sunni insurgency. They were armed. I was armed. They wanted to kill me. I wanted to kill them. But we were working through some kind of negotiated agreement where they would stop shooting at us, and as a result of that, we'd stop shooting at them. And over time, that proved to be an effective way of doing business, and we found some level of peace on the battlefields in Iraq. So that was another example in my career where I found myself in a circumstance where I had to work negotiation skills, build partnerships with people that I didn't choose to build partnerships with, was a necessary strategic partnership to allow that to evolve. I come out of Iraq, I take command of the 3rd Division at Fort Stewart, Georgia. I go back to Iraq. When President Bush announced the surge, he was talking about my division. I had the opportunity to take 25,000 soldiers into Iraq, into the worst places in Iraq as part of the surge. We finally had the forces to do what we needed to do, and we worked our way through major combat operations. And then we realized that the keys to the kingdom in Iraq were going to be able to influence the locals to focus on their own security and not on shooting at us, because they considered us to be occupiers. And that was details. My battle space was the size of the state of West Virginia, and as you can imagine, that took a lot of traveling and a lot of negotiation, and that's why we formed this thing called the Sons of Iraq. And the Sons of Iraq were really the local Iraqis who'd made a conscious decision that day to focus on what was best for their family. You know, I worry about this. Sometimes the national media, I believe, is a national embarrassment, and they portray the Iraqi people as some kind of evil people. They're not. There's 16 million peoples just like you and I. All they want is freedom from fear. They want a job to provide for their family. They want the kids to go to school. They want to have a clinic. They want to have potable water. They want to have electricity. They want what we want. What we realized then is if we got the local Iraqis at each of the villages to understand that if they stopped shooting at us, we could stop shooting at them and they could prosper, then we could indeed flourish. And as we took over battle space in that portion of Iraq, the Iraqi people would come to us and ask 3 questions. The first question was, are you staying? And they were convinced that we're staying. The next question was, how can we help? And then the third question was, can you provide for our families with things like schools and clinics and those kinds of things? So that's how we turned around that portion of Iraq. Using the Sons of Iraq. It's another example of building strategic partnership and working our way through negotiations. I left there, I commanded 3 Corps in Fort Hood, and as Doug says, then I took command of all the Army installations. Now let's think about this. The Army has 163 installations. Anybody been near or on an Army installation? You know, you probably have at some point in your life. Sarah and I spent most of our career at Fort Stewart, Georgia, or Fort Hood, Texas. I didn't realize until I took command of Installation Management Command that the Army had 163 installations, and they were indeed worldwide. And the workforce was 120,000 people. The operating budget was a $12.3 billion operating budget. So I found myself generally as a CEO of a Fortune 100 company. For the last 2 years, I was in active duty, and I had to work with this diverse workforce to accomplish our end states, to be victorious. Has anybody read a book entitled On War by a guy named Clausewitz? Well, let me give you the cliff notes. All military folks have to read this book, but Clausewitz, some old dead guy, wrote this book on war, And he says, generally, it's about ends, ways, and means. And this is important in your business like it was important in our business. He says, the ends are what you're trying to accomplish. I mean, if you're going to be victorious in whatever you're doing, you have to be able to define with great fidelity what you're trying to accomplish. What's your purpose? What's your end state? What are you trying to accomplish? That's your ends. In the U.S. government, my job, my end state in MCOM, as Doug mentioned, was to provide our soldiers, our families, and our civilians with the quality of life that was commensurate with their quality of service. That end remained the same. You got means, ends, ways, and means. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll realize that our nation is severely in debt, $14.3 trillion. And we can't leave that to our kids and their kids. So right now there's work in the halls of Congress to reduce that debt. And a part of the way they're doing that is going to take from the Department of Defense about $680 billion over the next 10 years. And that's going to trickle its way down to the services and in my job running the installations. So generally what I had was about $20 billion a year when I first got to the Pentagon. And then 2 years later I had $15 billion a year. But the end remained the same. Quality of life, commensurate quality of service. So if your means are down, but your end's constant, what do you got to do? You got to modify your ways. You got to do things different. You got to find strategic partners that you can work with to accomplish the ends with reduced resources. Now, I don't know much about what you're doing in your specific business, but I guarantee you're finding yourself in a condition where you probably got reduced resources. Resources being people, time, and money. Jim Jones taught me this, the same guy who made me go to Athens, Greece. Vision without resources is hallucination, right? Think about that. People, time, and money. You know, if you got this vision, I'm going to accomplish these things, but if you don't have the resources, all you're doing is having hallucinations. So let me take that basic background that I have in the military and apply it to what I think might be of interest to you. First thing, I want to talk about diversity. I worry. You know, I generally have been running civilian organizations for the last 3 years. Right now, I'm running this thing called the Automation and Robotics Research Institute at the University of Texas at Arlington. What I worry is in some cases, people shy away from diversity. That's exactly wrong. If you want to be prosperous, if you want to improve your performance, you got to celebrate diversity and not shy away from diversity. And leaders have to know how diverse their organization is. I knew precisely within MCOM, the 120,000 folks, what kinds of folks I had out there, and I made it a point to talk to them all the time and ensure I understood their needs. Their needs. Not my needs, their needs. Celebrating the diversity. I had the mayor of Fort Wayne, Indiana, come speak to all my leaders in my last organization I commanded. And he had written a book about how he turned that city around using Lean Six Sigma. Is anybody here knowledgeable of Lean Six Sigma and a fan of Lean Six Sigma? I am. It just shows you better ways to do business. Anyway, he got all my leaders together, it's about 600 folks, and he stood on a platform much like this, and he said, beware of the weebies. Everybody looked at him like, what the hell is he talking about, weebies? The weebies, in my case, are the folks who say, General, we be here before you got here, and we be here after you leave, right? We be here before you got here, and we be here after you leave. And you all know that in your respective organizations, you have some weebies. That's part of your diverse workforce. You just have to know who they are and make conscious effort to continue to work with them, to allow them to evolve, embrace the change, and be able to flourish. Doug's opening comments are powerful. That's what we're all about. In the training business, in the leader development business, we're all about improving people. Improving people, one person at a time. That's powerful. So you got to celebrate the diversity. You got to talk to your workforce. I worry about what's happening, I really do. Sarah and I were in Fulda, Germany in 1989, and November the 9th when the Warsaw Pact crumbled and the wall tumbled down, right? We were there. I was on actual border patrol between the East and West Germans when the wall came tumbling down. And we saw the East Germans migrate into West Germany and experience freedom for the first time. See, we as Americans, we take freedom for granted. I worry about that. That's all we've known freedom is here, freedom's gonna be here forever. That's just not true. It's just not true. And the East Germans, they experienced freedom for the first time, and that was a wonderful, wonderful thing. They came across the border in these, they're called Trabants, but they look really like Fred Flintstone cars. That's what they look like, you know. A whole bunch of Fred Flintstone cars came over, and Sarah and I got a chance to talk to the East Germans and just see the excitement that they were experiencing freedom for the first time. I'm convinced to this day that when the Warsaw Pact crumbled, it left two things to screw with us, right? The first thing that they left to screw with us, I'm convinced, is PowerPoint slides, right? I'm convinced of that. I'm allergic to podiums, and I'm allergic to PowerPoint slides. You know, I refuse to allow folks who work for me to do PowerPoint slides because, candidly, they're spending so much time making the electrons dance, they're not thinking about what's going on the slide. I mean, that, my personal opinion, I could be wrong. Sarah will probably tell me if I'm wrong or not, but that's true. I believe PowerPoint slides are evil. The other thing I'm convinced that the Warsaw Pact left to screw with us is email, right? Talk about an evil thing. That's evil. It's not communication. People think that when you're typing and sending an email, you're communicating. You're not. All you're doing is typing and sending. You don't know if the person received it. You don't know if the person understood it. You don't know if the person understands the passion under which it was sent. They don't see the underlying themes. It's not communication. So if you're a leader, or if you're training leaders or developing leaders, you have to promote physical leadership. Communication, talking to people, shaking hands, giving hugs. I was known in Iraq as the hugging general because it was about physical contact to show your appreciation, to show your love. I believe that leadership is a contact sport. And Doug, over the last 4 months, has taught me a lot of things, and I now realize that that was an original idea. I convinced myself that me and Jack had come up with that idea. You all know who Jack is, right? I spend a lot of time with Jack. We talk all the time. We sit down late at night. We work through issues. Me and Jack had come up with this idea, I thought, original, that leadership is a contact sport. Jack's last name is Daniels. Jack Daniels. Well, we spend a lot of time together. I mean, we've become very close, and over the course of time, I find that we work our way through lots of things. The problem is I don't remember the next day what we came up with, but I'm going to start writing all that down. But if you indeed want to celebrate diversity and know your workforce, leadership is a contact sport. You got to get out and about. I mean, my worldwide organization, I had folks in Italy, I had folks in Germany, I had folks in the Pacific, I had folks all across the United States of America, and Sarah and I traveled all the time. 163 installations. In about 18 months, we took 82 trips to 82 different installations. And what I made it a point to do is do town halls, things like this, where not only did I get to hear from them, but they got to see me. Not just the guy on the VTC or not just the guy sending out proclamations, but rather the human being named Rick Lynch. Leadership is indeed a contact sport, and it's all part of celebrating diversity. And the last thing I worry about, and I tried to make a conscious decision to fix this then and now, is some people surround themselves with people just like them. And that's a mistake. That is a fundamental mistake. You want to surround yourself by folks different than you. And I'll use a personal example. In 1982, I was a dashing young captain. That might be hard to believe, but I was, 1982. And Sarah was the director of Parks and Recreation for Killeen, Texas. That was her job. And I was in the process of registering my softball team for the local tournament, and her secretary wasn't there that day, so she had to take care of me personally. And what happened, and I'm standing on this end of the podium, Doug, because she can't throw this far. What happened was she got my name off the application and just incessantly bothered me until I'd take her out. She called. It was embarrassing. She called all the time. And then eventually I said, okay, if you promise you'll quit calling me, I'll take you out one time. How many of you believe that story? Right. No, what really happened is I fell in love instantaneously. Her father was a Master Sergeant United States Army since deceased. Her mother was a Sergeant E5 United States Army. Her dad had said, whatever you do, don't date a GI. So I was working my way through that. And it took me $690 worth of flowers in 1982 before she would agree to marry me. That's a lot of flowers in 1982, right? Yellow roses, yellow rose of Texas. So in preparation for getting married, we had to go see a military chaplain. His name was Tom Mitchner. And Tom said, okay, well, I'll marry you two, but before I do, you have to take this personality test. I want to make sure you're compatible. So we took the test, we went away, we came back in 3 days later. He had graded the test, he set us down, he had this ashen look on his face, and he said, whatever you do, don't get married. He said, I've never seen two people more different. Never in the history of this test have two people pegged out purely different. And we said, okay, we got you, but we still want to get married, and we're going to prove. And that's what's happened. Candidly, over the last 30 years, we have been strengthened because we were different. We were different. And I was a pegged out introvert. She was a pegged out extrovert. Over time, we've kind of grown together. The moral of that story is still powerful because you got to surround yourself by people different than you. You have to. It's an amazing thing to me. You know, when I commanded the Installation Management Command, I had 1,000 people in my headquarters, and the average age in my headquarters was 53. Just think about that. I had a 90-year-old employee in my headquarters because in the federal government, once you're there forever. You're there forever, right? So the average age was 53. Well, people say, well, that's lots of experience. That's probably a good thing, but it probably is. But there's a struggle with change when you're fixated like that, the weebies. And the biggest problem we were having was the use of social media, right? The use of social media. I mean, you know, a lot of you are a lot younger than me, probably most of you are, but I'm convinced that my son and my daughter have forgotten that those little handheld devices you can actually speak into, right? You can actually speak into them because we spend so much time texting and sending pictures back and forth. It's an amazing thing to me. But if you want to get your story out, I'm going to talk about communication in a minute, you have to use social media. You know, I went to one of the garrisons that I commanded, and the colonel who was the garrison commander was so proud of this public service announcement he had just prepared on energy conservation. He and his sergeant major went through the dramatic effect of turning off lights, and it was a big deal. It was about a minute public service announcement that was going to be aired on the local insulation TV station. I said, good job. And then I go to 600 people, a town hall he wanted me to talk to. And I asked the question, how many of you actually watch the local TV station? Of the 600 folks, how many raised their hand? 2 people. 2 people, right? So I asked the question then, like I asked in all cases, if I give you a choice of 3 in terms of how you're getting your information these days, please raise your hand. The first option is tactile, newspapers and magazines. And that's what I still like to do. I mean, to me, it's almost a nightmare scenario to be staring at a computer screen. But I love the fact that I can get newspapers and read newspapers and get information that way. We trained one of our Labrador retrievers to retrieve the newspaper and bring it in every morning. I love that. That's how I get my information. I said that's one category. The next category is TV or radio. And the third category is internet. Guess what percentage, substantiated percentage, of folks in the U.S. military are getting their information off the internet? 90%. 90%. So if you don't surround yourself with folks who understand that, can do the website work, can do the Facebook, can do the Twitter, then you're making a major mistake. You know, I don't know how many followers I had in my Facebook in my last few positions, but it was lots of them. But I never did Facebook one time. But I had a 26-year-old person who traveled with me everywhere I went. She listened very closely to what I had to say, and then she would post on Facebook, post things that sounded just like me because she'd heard me talk so much. So there's all these folks out thinking I'm communicating with the general, but they weren't communicating with the general. They were communicating with this lady, this 26-year-old lady who understood social media. So the point is, surround yourself by people and advocate in your leader training, advocate that they surround themselves by people different than themselves. There's power in diversity, there really is. Now, does it make it more difficult? Sure. I mean, if you just had a bunch of people sitting around the table and they were all just like you, would it be easier? Sure. But you wouldn't be maximizing your potential. You wouldn't be growing the way you should be growing. Let me get into the 3 C's and give you some techniques that I've used over my career that might be of use to you in terms of increasing strategic partnership and maximizing your potential, improving your overall performance. The first one is communication. Everywhere I led groups of people, to include now, the adage is constant communication is critical. Constant communication is critical. You got to be talking all the time. Does anybody here believe that people come to work intending to screw up that day? I mean, have you found that person who says, here's my plan, I'm going to get out of bed, I'm going to go into work today, and I'm just going to screw up, and I'll do that for about 8 hours, and then I'll go home and do it again the next day? Has anybody found that person? Because I have not found that person. Thank God. Thank God. There might be a couple in the room. I see you all looking at each other, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, if indeed that person wants to do better, we have to talk to that person. Constant communication is critical. In the U.S. military, we struggled with counseling, which is almost an embarrassment. Because if a person wants to do better, somebody has to sit them down routinely and say, okay, let's talk about your performance, whether it's monthly or quarterly or semi-annual, it doesn't matter. But let's just kind of sit down and talk about your performance. So what I instituted in the units that I led, and what I have going on right now, is a simple counseling form. There was a blank sheet of paper divided into 3 blocks. And the top block was strengths. Because you always accentuate the positive in the counseling. Make them feel good about themselves. Make sure they know that you acknowledge that they got some great strengths that are an important part of the team. The second one is areas for improvement. Now, I didn't say weaknesses, because if you start talking about weaknesses, what happens? They shut down on you. Who the hell you think you are talking to me about my weaknesses? So areas for improvement. And the way I approach that counseling is we would talk about, okay, what can we together do to improve our performance? What can we do together to improve our performance? One of the things I hate is the use of the first person pronoun. And candidly, where I am right now in the university setting, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of this is mine, this is my, this is I did this, right? That's not helpful for anybody. It's really not. You got to outlaw the use of the first person pronoun. But if you counsel people routinely, they will improve. It's all about communication. The second thing is, there's no excuse not to communicate. There is no excuse not to communicate. 163 installations worldwide, 120,000 people, and I was talking to them all the time. How was I doing that? Traveling around, face-to-face, town halls, communicate. Video teleconferences. Routine video teleconferences, regardless of whether you were in the Pacific or in Germany or Korea or you're in the U.S., routinely the leaders would join me in a video teleconference and we would communicate. Documents, shared documents, communication. So please, if you find yourself in a situation where folks say, well, we just can't effectively communicate because we're just too spread out, we got too much going on, that's just wrong, and it is fraught with failure. Communication, constant communication is critical. The next one, collaboration. You can't form strategic partnerships that are going to be effective if you don't have collaboration. It's just physically impossible. It just can't happen. It can't happen. No, I explained to you my situation when I was in Iraq, where I was dealing with the Sunni insurgents, and I was trying to convince them not to shoot at me or us, and we were trying to make sure that we wouldn't shoot at them. That was all about collaboration. That was trying to find, what are we trying to accomplish here collectively? How do we get to that point where we're all going to move towards that? Let's build some consensus here. As a general officer, what we're taught is the art of consensus building, right? Here's what I was taught 10 years ago when I became a general. If you really want to form strategic partnerships, you got to look for those common denominators. Where can you build that consensus? Where is everybody generally in agreement? But as a general officer and as a leader, you got to draw a red line in the sand. And every now and then you got to say, okay, I'm going to work to collaborate, but I'm not going to cross this line. I'm just not going to go over here because it violates my values, it violates my principle, it violates what I believe is right. The reason I'm here tonight is because I fell in love with Doug Arwood. I just got to tell you. I told people when I retired that I was going to only do meaningful and substantive work, and I was only going to be around people with shared values. And as soon as I had a chance to meet Doug, and we've talked on the phone numerous times, I realized that he and I have shared values. And I know that his line in the sand is about the same as my line in the sand, that we're just not going to go across that. So it's all about consensus building when you talk about collaboration. You got to find that common denominator. What do you need to do as you're building a strategic partnership and working through collaboration? You got to find that sweet spot. What's their incentive? What are they focused on? What are they trying to accomplish? And play to that. George Patton. I've studied all the military leaders over time, and candidly, that's one of the ways I work to try to improve myself. Patton said, it's amazing how much you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. That's one of the things that we're struggling with is people saying, well, I'm only going to collaborate, I'm only going to be part of this partnership if indeed I get the appropriate credit. That's just not helpful. It's not helpful. So we, as an Army, we have 1.1 million people, and we have an annual budget of about $245 billion. That budget's going to go down significantly over the next 5 years based on our national deficit. So what we decided to do is to run all aspects of the military like an enterprise. And I ran the services and infrastructure core enterprise. Anybody who had anything to do in our installations with services, providing a service, or building infrastructure, they all worked for me. And on a routine basis, we'd get together in a core enterprise meeting and we'd talk about, okay, here's what we're trying to accomplish collectively. What are you going to do? How did I make sure that they didn't shut down in the course of the conversation? I highlighted for them the common denominator. I highlighted for them what's in it for them. I talked about we really don't care who gets the credit. Has anybody served in a university setting? In the last 4 weeks now, I did accept a position as the as the executive director for the Automation and Robotics Research Institute at the University of Texas at Arlington, because I have a background in robotics. I went to MIT to get my graduate degree, so I understand advanced technology. But a university setting is a totally different environment. It's just a totally different environment. And it's not just about, I did this and this is mine. It's not just about, hey, some of the faculty members are tenured and you couldn't get rid of them if you wanted to. It's not just about that. It's really about figuring out what motivates them, what brings them to the table. And in my line of work, what brings them to the table is connections that I have that they don't have based on my background. And, oh, by the way, finding funding for students so the faculty has graduate students with which to do their research. So I know that. That's in my mind now. So as I'm having conversations with them, I'm thinking, how do we make sure that they walk away from the conversation realizing that this is good for them? That's how you build strategic partnerships. That's how you make sure that everybody realizes that there's a common denominator here and a common good. You have to do that. And if you don't take that enterprise approach, candidly, I think you're struggling. The third C is commitment. And of the 3 C's, I think it's the most important, so let me spend some time on this one. I don't believe that anybody comes to work intentionally trying to screw up. I don't believe that. We talked about that. I don't believe that people are trying to be problems. I think that they need counseling. I think they need mentorship. Is anybody in this room a mentor? Are you a mentor? No, in the military, maybe it's not that way in your business. In the military, we struggled with what the definition of a mentor was. In 2001, prior to 9/11, we had a mass exodus to the U.S. Army of our captains. Captains were leaving the Army. And I was involved in studying why that was happening. And what they told us generally was that we're leaving the Army because nobody's talking to us anymore. We're looking for mentors, and nobody's mentoring us. And then we talked to the senior leaders, and 75% of them said, I'm a mentor. So there's a clear disconnect. So we worked through this with the definition of mentorship that may be of use to you. If you're going to be a mentor, you got to have 3 characteristics. You have to be accessible, you have to listen, and you have to truly care. Now, you go back to your hotel room tonight, I tell youngsters all the time, the most important piece of furniture in your house is your mirror. Routinely, you ought to be looking in the mirror and assessing how you're doing, right? That's one way to improve. How am I doing? With an honest, candid self-assessment. So if you think you're a mentor, I'd ask you to kind of grade yourself on those 3 criteria. Are you really accessible? Do you truly listen? And do you truly care? And as you're training leaders and you're developing leaders to improve your performance, I'd ask you to concentrate on mentorship. Do you have to be in the person's supervisory chain to be their mentor? Of course not. Of course not. You just have to be a caring, compassionate human being trying to help other people. My favorite book is a book entitled A Life God Rewards by Bruce Wilkinson. If you haven't read that, I'd recommend you read it. It's a real simple read. And in the book, the author generally says, God really doesn't care how many stars you wear or how much money you make. He cares about how many people you touch. I mean, we're all supposed to be, as members of this thing called mankind, we're all supposed to be working to help other people. Doug said it in his opening comments. To do that, I think you got to be an aggressive mentor. You just can't say you're a mentor. You have to be a mentor, and you have to have those criteria. Who here is a good listener? Be honest with yourself, because most of us are not. Most of us are not. And I find the most difficult thing that I do in my line of work is active listening. You have to promote that. You have to study that. You have to concentrate on that. Now in the university setting, I got 72 PhD kind of folks working for me. And not one of them is named Bubba, right? Because they're all from somewhere else. They're all from Pakistan or Iran or from India. I mean, if you have not read Friedman's book entitled That Used to Be Us, I'd recommend that for your professional library. And in general terms, Thomas Friedman talks about the way it used to be as a nation, the way it is as a nation, and the way it could be. And all the struggles we're having right now as a nation is a function of poor leadership. And I'm not talking about individuals, I'm talking about collectively, whether it's in the education world, whether it's in the manufacturing world, whether it's in the economy, whether it's in government, it's just poor leadership. And we have to work to improve that. There's just no doubt about that. But Friedman says in the book that we're exporting intellect, and we are. If you study this, at the University of Texas at Arlington and at MIT when I was there, about 90% of the students are foreign nationals. But they're coming in, they're learning all these great things at our major universities, and then our immigration laws cause them to have to leave. They don't want to leave, but we're making them leave, so we're exporting that intellectual property, which really just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, back to mentoring, listening, speaking, talking. It's a difficult active listening technique for me to use with all the professors from China and Iran and Pakistan, but it's a technique that you have to have. Number 2 on commitment, and Sarah taught me this. It's a line from John Maxwell. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Think about that. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, right? It's amazing to me the exponential increase of performance of individuals and organizations if you have a caring environment where you truly care. It's not just a 9-to-5 kind of relationship and then you go home. I believe that leaders, regardless whether you're a military leader or a civilian leader, whatever you're into, if you're a leader, you have to care about your subordinates like you care about your own children. I believe that's true. I've always called my subordinates my children because I love them like my children. And a good leader, to ensure commitment, a good leader asks intrusive questions. What can we do to get you through that? So if you're going to have committed employees, you have to be a compassionate leader. And people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And it really is deeds, not words. You've all been around folks in the past who pop up their chest and say, I care. But they don't demonstrate that they care. I care. It takes you about 37 seconds to see through the smoke and mirrors and realize that the person really doesn't care. The next thing on commitment. If you believe that the individual wants to do as well as he can, and you believe that he wants to be an active member and a vibrant member of the community and the organization, then you have to empower not just the individual, but the collective group. In this organization I run now, we're getting together on Friday, and we're talking about our assessment as an organization. I'd recommend you use this technique that I started as a lieutenant out of West Point in 1977, and I use to this day. If you're getting a group of people together, pass out some blank 3x5 cards and say, hey, on the front side, write what you like the best about this organization. On the back side, write what we need to work on. Do it in an anonymous fashion so they don't feel like they're going to be in trouble after they put the issues on the backside, and then allow you to get that and then study that. That's how you can see commitment from the organization and not just the individual. Does that make sense? 3 C's: communication, collaboration, and commitment. And I'm going to leave you with 2 things that I think are unbelievably important. The reason that I make these presentations is try to touch lives and make a difference. And Doug's given me this opportunity. So I'm not going to miss the opportunity. When you deploy to combat, and I've had now 4 years, 5 years in combat, the Gulf War, a year in Kosovo, 3 years in Iraq. When you deploy to combat, many folks deploy to combat and come back devastated. And many folks deploy to combat and come back enriched. What do you think the difference was? The difference was this topic of resiliency. Resiliency. I mean, if you really want to take an organization to the next level, form strategic partnerships, and get the maximum performance you possibly can, you got to advocate resiliency. And we've studied this in the military. There are 5 components of resiliency. One is a spiritual component. I mean, I personally start every day in prayer. Every day in prayer. Next to my Bible in my office are the pictures of the 153 soldiers who died on the battlefield on a place that I placed them, and I got to live with that the rest of my life. But I spread out their faces, I pray for them, and I pray for their families. And I ask God for the strength, courage, and wisdom to do what He wants me to do. In the most difficult days in Iraq, on one particular day, 7 soldiers under my command died in a house that was rigged as a house-borne improvised explosive device. 7 kids all at the same time. On another occasion, a platoon was attacked, 7 kids were killed, and 2 were taken captive. And we spent 8 months looking for those last 2 soldiers. We finally found their bodies. On those occasions, I dropped to my knees in prayer, and I asked God for strength, courage, and wisdom to get me through difficult circumstances, and He did indeed do that. It's a component of resiliency. Another component of resiliency is physical resiliency. You got to be physically fit. I mean, can you imagine how difficult it is in places like Iraq or Afghanistan? Now that we're back in Texas, people say, hey, Lynch, it's hot in Texas. Hot in Texas. So let me tell you what hot is. Hot was 120 degrees, wearing 70 pounds of body armor, and people shooting at me. That was hot. All right, that was hot. Everything else is less than hot. My battle space was the size of the state of West Virginia, so I flew around in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter a lot. I had 659 hours in the back of a Black Hawk. And for whatever reason, every time I flew from point A to point B, people were shooting at me, which really didn't make any sense to me because I'm a pretty nice guy. It might have had something to do with the fact that I was trying to kill them. Maybe that's what made them mad. But anyway, I realized flying around in the back of that Black Hawk what my underwear feels like in the clothes dryer, right? Has to be the same thing, right? 120 degrees, that air circling around back there. I'm thinking, this has to be what my underwear feels like in the clothes dryer. The way I made it through that is because I was physically fit, and as a result of that, physically resilient. Another piece is emotional resiliency. Emotional resiliency. You know, there's a book out that talks about, and Sarah made me read this now many times, it's not just about intelligence quotient, but it's also emotional quotient. How do you deal with other people? How do you work your way through difficult situations dealing with other people? And if I didn't have some emotional resiliency, you know, dealing with the insurgents in Iraq or dealing with the folks I'm dealing with now would be a struggle. Another one is the family resiliency. You know, I told you when I started talking, I draw my strength from my relationship with God, number one, my family, number two. That's my priority. And the last one is societal resiliency. So what I would think you might want to do in your respective organizations and your industry is to work programs to promote resiliency. Because people are going through difficult times. It's not just about going to combat and coming back. It's going into situations where your job is uncertain. It's going in situations you're not really sure what's going to happen with the organization tomorrow. I get this all the time because most of the organizations I talk to are on some level of turbulence. You're doing some kind of change, right? What's that do to the workforce? It scares them to death. It scares them to death because they're not really sure they're going to have a job tomorrow, and they have to provide for their families. So I'd ask that you think about resiliency. And the last thing I'd ask you to think about is work-life balance. I'll use a military analogy, but it applies to you as well. In the U.S. military, if you assume command of a formation, there's always a big parade, right? And you're there on the podium, and you got your family on either side, and all these youngsters are doing what we call a pass and review. And they come by, and at the end of the parade, you walk off with them because you're now in charge. You go with them. And for a couple years, you're in charge. What's important to remember is 2 years later, there's going to be another parade. Same kind of formation, soldiers passing in review, and when they're all done, they walk away. The new guy in charge is going to go away with them, and you're standing there on that podium, just you and your family. And if you sacrificed your family during those 2 years, they might not be there with you. I worry about that. I worry about that. My parents lived in Hamilton, Ohio. I grew up in Hamilton, Ohio. Went off to West Point in 1973. Every Sunday for my entire adult life, I called my parents. And Mom would always answer the phone. 3 years ago, Mom passed away. And it's still hard to this day when I call home and she's not answering. But I'm a man of faith, and I believe she's here. I believe she's sitting right there critiquing this performance like she always did. I believe that's true. Unfortunately, my dad doesn't have that faith. So every time I go back to Hamilton, Ohio, he said, let's go visit your mom, because he thinks Mom's out there buried at the graveyard. I don't believe that's true. And as much as I talk to him about that, I can't seem to get the point across. So like a dutiful son, I take him out to the graveyard. And every time I do that, I'm walking by these tombstones, and I'm seeing start dates, and I'm seeing end dates, and I'm seeing a dash. So the question is always, how you live in your dash when it's all said and done. Because it is all going to be said and done. I don't care if you're the CEO, the COO, senior vice president. At the end of the day, that's all going to go away, and somebody else is going to be the CEO, but you're still going to be there with your family, hopefully. So the question is, how did you live your dash? Did you indeed spend a life touching lives and making a difference to live that dash? That's very important. So for all of you, thank you for what you do. For Doug, thank you for allowing me to be here. You can indeed be victorious. You can indeed be victorious, and a critical component of that would be increasing strategic partnerships and improving overall performance. And I believe the essence of that is advocating resiliency, communicating, collaborating, and being committed. And at the end of it, I'd ask you to think about your personal resiliency and your organization's resiliency and how you're living your dash. God bless you all. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Stay up here for just a second.
Thank you. Thanks.
And let me ask, does anybody have any questions for Rick? Anybody have any questions?
Please, sir.
Rick, when you're talking about communication, you talked about counseling forums, you talked about three things. You said strengths, areas for improvement, which you never mentioned.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, do you ever have those senior moments? I do that all the time. I'm thinking, what the hell did I do yesterday? The third one is objectives. You and your, Sarah says, maybe I got to find a better word for subordinate, in a civilian community, but in the military we call them subordinate, but you know what I'm talking about. You and your associate, as part of the counseling, you ought to agree on your objectives for the next counseling period. What are you going to get done in the next 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? And then when it comes back again, you sit down with the old form, say, okay, here's what we agreed to, how do we do? And then you do the next counseling. It's just powerful. The trick, though, is to make sure you're not talking about weaknesses, because you don't want the counseling to be a negative experience. You don't want that. Thank you for that. Yes, ma'am.
When you talk about counseling and mentoring, so do you really think it more of a coaching opportunity when you're talking about future leaders?
Yeah.
How do you relate that to coaching?
Yeah, that's a great point. See, I think counseling is performed by the organizational structure. I believe that's true. I believe bosses counsel their subordinates and on direct reports, whatever it might be. It's more regimented, and it's fixated on performance in that particular capacity. The mentoring piece, and I believe it's teach, coach, and mentor. I put those all together. It's really a broader perspective. What do you want to be in 10 years, 15 years? Where do you see yourself? I mean, what we have to do as we develop leaders is to help them articulate, where do you want to be in about 10 years, and then coach, teach, and mentor them to be able to figure out how to get there. That's my view of the difference. Does that make sense? Other questions? In the back, please. The toughest examples of collaboration? Yeah. You know, I use this one because I didn't tell this story yet. So I went to Kosovo for a year. Does anybody remember Kosovo? You know, in addition to we as a nation have a short-term memory, we also want to rush to a conclusion. You know, so our president sent us to the Balkans for a year 15 years ago, and we're still there. Right? We're still there. We just forget that we're there, but soldiers are still there. So I was the chief of staff of the Kosovo force, and my staff was 600 people from 29 different nations, and that was a struggle in itself. But we were responsible to try to get the Kosovo Albanians to keep killing the Kosovo Serbs and vice versa, so this country called Kosovo could flourish. That's why we were there. So I went to see the senior Albanian. His name was Ramush Haradinaj, who ended up being the prime minister of Kosovo. I said, now Ramush, here's the deal. If I can get you and the Serbs to quit shooting at each other, collectively we can work for the common good and get ourselves to a situation where Kosovo can flourish and pull itself away from Serbia, which is what they wanted to do. Ramush Haradinaj looked me in the eye and said, General, the Serbs killed 2 of my brothers and 4 of my cousins. And if you think I'm going to forget that anytime soon, you're badly mistaken. And I realized right then that the collaboration there was going to be extremely difficult because it was a generational issue. It was a generational issue. It wasn't going to be fixed that day or that year. It was going to be fixed once the kids grew up. So we made a conscious decision in terms of collaboration, try to get environments where the kids grew up together, not hating each other, so in 15 to 20 years you'd have a peaceful society. And we've candidly, you know, kind of made good progress there. But that was an extremely difficult area of collaboration. Dealing with the Sunni insurgents was very difficult. Dealing with the NATO forces was difficult in itself. But you just got to look for that common good. What's the thing you're all trying to do? Concentrate on the common good, and then not be afraid to compromise. Not be afraid to say, okay, I wanted this, but I'm not going to get this. You can have that. Let's find that consensus and build a consensus. Ma'am.
I was wondering, because we often say in HP, you know, it'd be nice if we were military. We could demand certain things of our audiences.
Yeah.
They would listen to us because we were their general. But that isn't the way it is.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, in your comparison to your work now, with your civilians who are working with you, versus there's sort of a military construct that kind of supports a lot of the things you were saying.
Yep.
Kind of a fence around things.
Mhm.
You know, they naturally are following orders. How is it different, and how are you applying these
Yeah.
things today, and then saying like, geez, you know, this worked,
Yeah.
this seemed to work easier than this other?
Well, I mean, it would be naive to believe it wasn't easier commanding a purely military formation than it was commanding an organization that's primarily civilians. But I had the opportunity to do both. You know, my last 2 years was 120,000 people, only 2,000 soldiers, the rest were civilians. And it's generally true, not always true, generally true, that when you have a military formation, you say, let's go left, and they all say, yes, sir, and go left, right? In a civilian organization, you say, let's go left, Some of them do. Some of them say, yeah, I'll do it, but they don't really. And some of them say, screw you, I'm not going left. I mean, I got that, right? But a lot of the leadership principles I've refined over time, I can still apply in a civilian organization. I think everything I just talked about has direct application to organizations that are predominantly civilian. I believe that's true. And I use those techniques in MCOM, and I'm using them now at the University of Texas at Arlington. So I wouldn't argue the point that it was easier. I mean, Task Force Marne was 25,000 soldiers with a dedicated purpose in Iraq. 3 Corps in Fort Hood was 65,000 soldiers with a dedicated purpose in Central Texas, and that was okay, but the dealing with the civilian organization was more of a challenge, but not insurmountable. Does that make sense? So I wouldn't write off all the military stuff and say that only applies in the military. I look for application in the civilian world. Yeah. Other questions? Well, I got a question. So why did Doug Harwood promise me some bourbon if I flew all the way from Dallas to here, and all he's been feeding me is iced tea and water? I mean, that's my fundamental question.
I'm not going to answer the question because I didn't organize the booze. How's that? You know what? On behalf of everybody here in the training industry, we really appreciate it. Again, thank you for Rick Conference.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks, folks. Thank you.